Hi there, we're going to try to put together a Flash illustration tutorial on how to mess around with spheres, and in particular we're going to show a tutorial on how to make the eyeball, because all it is a bunch of circles and spheres, but it's the control of gradients and transparency, or alpha, that makes all the difference with this. So I'm going to start off with a new Flash document, and I'm going to make this fit my space a little bit better, starting with a Flash file action script 2, just to get going, and I'm going to edit the size of it so that it is a nice 800 by 450, which is sort of a widescreen aspect ratio, and double click the hand tool so that it fits on the screen nicely. And I'm going to use layers to try to create this. And the first layer that I'm going to create is, I'm going to call it the, I'm just going to call it the eyeball, because it's sort of the white of the eye. So here's where it starts. We're going to use an ordinary oval tool, and I'm going to try to make the eyeball about the right size. And I'm not worrying about what color it is just yet, because we're going to change the colors as we go with the paint palette tool up top. I notice when I drew this, it has a bounding box, which means I had the object drawing mode on, which means it sort of pre-groups it, and that'll work out okay. What's important though is that I want to be able to access this color, and to do that I've got to double click the object. So now I'm inside that grouped object, and now I can select it. I notice that I have a stroke around the outside, and I'm just going to delete that. Grab that fill, and now I'm going to start playing with gradients, and this is the secret of this whole thing. Right now I'm using a solid fill, and notice I'm in fill mode. I'm playing with a solid. I'm going to change that to radial, and when I change it to radial, it's going to give me whatever the last gradient is that I ever used. And the thing about an eyeball is it tends to be lighter in the middle and darker around the outside, so I'm going to reverse these things, which is easy enough to do, and try tweaking these colors a little bit. So now it's light on the inside, it's a little too dark on the outside, so when I grab this, I call it a crayon, but it's really just the key color that's there. I'm going to take that up to a gray, maybe about a third of the way down. And this one here, it's up at a white. I might bring it down just a little bit so I can have higher highlights than that. And I'll try this and see how it works. So there's our gradient, and it's a radial gradient, and I can modify it more. If I go to the paint bucket, I've kind of pre-stored this gradient inside my fill. And when I use the paint bucket tool, I can click anywhere in the sphere and change where the highlight is. So there's the lighter part of the eyeball. And I want to have the lighting sort of coming from the top right. So that's doing the job for me. And that's it. That's phase one. I'm going to go back to the scene. Next, I'm going to use layers to create a new layer above. And I'm going to call this the iris. And I'm not sure why this tool is popping up on me, but oh well, I'm going to click on my selection tool and get rid of it. And for the iris, okay, I'm going to choose a color, and again, this is sort of random. I'll choose something bluey. I'll use this, and I'm still in object drawing mode. So when I draw, it's going to pre-group it for me. And I get that sort of stock stroke and fill. So I'm going to double click it again, and I'm going to get rid of the stroke. I'm going to select this, and I'm going to, again, use a gradient. I'm going to, having selected that fill, I can go up and say, okay, I don't want it to be a solid color. That was just a starting place. I'll go to radial, and it'll pick up the same gradient that I used before, but this time what I'd like to do is choose some color. So I'm going to select this crayon, and I'll choose a color that I think might look like a good eyeball color, more or less. And I'm looking at the hue right now. I want it to be purple, sort of a bluey green, maybe. And I guess I want it to be sort of saturated, so I'll drag it upwards, a little more in the blues. And notice that the tone is pretty light, so I can darken that tone out like this. Okay, that's kind of doing the job. And that's not exactly what I want for an eye, so what I have to do is I have to choose this color to match this one and just make it a lighter version. And I can do that pretty easily by double-clicking it, hovering over the other color and clicking it once. Now I have what looks like a solid color, but I can go back to this one and I can say, okay, make this one light, but in the same hue. And this one here, I'm going to make it really dark around the outside like that. Okay, so I've got my hue for my iris color. Now, the thing about an eyeball is these two things should be perfectly aligned. And I can align these objects by, oops, I'm inside drawing object. I have to go back to the main scene. If I select both these objects with the Shift key, or if I just go Control A and select these objects, I can now align these things. There's a window align option, and I've docked it over here. It brings up a dialog that looks like this. There it is. Whoops. And when I select these things, I can align their centers, and I'm aligning them to the stage as I align them between each other as well, just so that they put them dead center in the middle of the stage, kind of like that. And I'll do the same thing horizontal or vertically. So now, that's the thing about an eye. The iris and the white of the eye, the eyeball, are going to be perfectly aligned. And the next level up that I have to go from eyeball to iris. Let's put in a pupil. And pupils are real easy. I don't want to select anything. I want to deselect by clicking outside. And a pupil's just going to be black. I don't need any stroke, so I'll turn off the stroke. And I'm just going to, oops, you know what? I'll draw it right on there. And I'm going to make the pupil relatively large. I found that that looks a little bit better. So there's my pupil. And again, I want to align these things, so I'll hold Shift and select all three objects and click those two buttons to make them perfectly aligned. So there's the start of it. Now I notice there's not so much dramatic shading that's taking place on this white of the eye. So I'm going to go back to it, click it, and I'd like to get its color again and sort of play around with it a bit. To retrieve that gradient color and make it a little more dynamic, I'm going to use the eyedropper tool and select that fill. Notice that I'm inside the object to do that. And now that I've done that, I could click this. I've got it stored here. I can pretty freely go back to the palette. Now notice it says type none. For some reason it snapped over to the stroke, because that was the last thing I guess I messed with over in the toolbar. I have to go back to fill. Oh yeah, and there it has. It's remembered my fill. It's remembered everything about it, but you know what? I just want to make it a little bit more dynamic. So I'll make it a little bit darker like this. And maybe I'll try making it a little bit lighter like that. And back to the scene. So hopefully this is looking more and more impressive. Now, as we look at the original bit that we had here, this is looking really glossy, and that's because we have highlights and we have gloss and we have a shadow. So we're going to put those elements together right now. The easiest of this for sure is going to be the gloss, or sorry, the highlights. And that's just going to be a circle. It's going to be white. It's going to have no stroke. And just by putting a couple of circles on this, oops, undo. Now when I did this, the circle disappeared. I wonder why that is. Oh, because I was drawing on the eyeball layer. Got to pay attention to your layers. Let's put some highlights. Let's put them on their own layer like this. Try again. Okay, so there is a little highlight there. And a little, whoops, highlight there. And a smaller one. There it is here. That'll do. And that gives us sort of that nice reflective look. And if we get it there, playing around with this, I'm going to duplicate those two elements and kind of put them up here too, so that I have them sort of echoing on two things. It's like this has a slightly different curve than this. And I guess I could actually make these things a little bit bigger over here too. So I'll kind of put it up there like that. So there's phase one. You know what, I'm going to move them up a little higher. But still sort of in line like that. As we jump back to our reference, the other big thing here is this gloss up here. And this gloss is actually pretty easy. I'm going to put a layer under the highlights but above the pupil. And the gloss is again going to be just another oval. And I've still got my white up there. The oval that I'm going to want to do is an oval that is just, as I look at it, starting at the top, just grazing the top but leaving a little bit of the eyeball behind, and not quite getting, just cutting into the pupil a little bit. So I'm going to start about out here and draw myself something that's roughly the right shape like that. And again, it's an object. Now, it's not the right width, so I can use the transform tool, and I'll grab the sides, and I'll grab the top, and I'm going to try to keep this symmetrical. I notice it's snapping to the very top of the object there, and I don't really want that. I want more control, so I'll go up to View, Snapping, and I'll turn off Snap to Objects so that I can fine-tune this a little bit more and it won't be quite so snappy. And I'll bring this so it just kind of grazes and leaves a little eclipse around that top outside. Yeah, that'll do. And of course we want this to be more or less centered. Now we could use this to center it, but I can eyeball, no pun intended, eyeball that and make sure it looks good. And now what I want to play around with is the gradient in here. I want this actually to be transparent. And again, we're going to this color palette up here. And right now this thing is just a solid white. We're going to go to a new gradient called linear. That means it kind of goes from one direction to the other, or from one side to the other. And the gradient that I want to do is I'd like to have this be white, going to white, but I'd like it to start at a at an alpha, that is how opaque it is, I'd like it to start at about maybe 40% or so. And I'd like it to finish, if I select this one, whoops, that should be white. Clicking on this, I'd like it to finish at about, let's say 10%. Or so. Doesn't have to be precise. So what I get, and you see this here and in the palette, is you can now see through the white. Click it again, and looking at it, you can also see through this, and you can see the grid behind it. You can double check this, click it. Okay, that's 10% on that side, but it starts at 40%. And now I want that to be very directional. I'll use the paint bucket tool again, and I want it to start like at 40%, and I want it to finish at 10%. Now I've got to unlock this. The last mode I used this fill tool with, it locked the fill, which means it locks where its highlight is and where its low light is. I'm going to unlock it, so now I can repaint the gradient inside that object. So it starts at 40 and goes to 10, and you can sort of see the effect there. But when I go back to the scene, you really see the effect. And there it is. There's the gloss up at the top. So the thing's starting to look really, well, 3D. And I want to duplicate that at the with my reference. I can see another one down at the bottom would be good if I had a shadow to go along with it. Well, this isn't going to take too long. I'm just going to duplicate this right in layer 5. I'm going to call this gloss. If I just duplicated this whole shape, I know it's about the right shape, and I'm going to put it down at the bottom. And it looks like it would kind of match there. I'll double click it, and I'll click on this, and I'm just going to modify this a little bit. Instead of it being white, I'm going to say, let's take it to black. So it actually becomes sort of a gray. And I'll have it go from 40 to 10 in black and see what that looks like. Now it's starting darker at the top and lighter at the middle. That is, it's more opaque here and more transparent here. So I could reverse that really easily if I just flip these two things around. That's probably the easiest way to do it. Okay. So now it's dark at the bottom and kind of fades up there. And when I go back to the scene, you get the idea that it's kind of making this gloss look to it. Now, if it's a little too pronounced, certainly we can, modify that a little bit and make it a little bit more transparent. Maybe instead of 40, I could take it to 30. Maybe instead of 10, I could take it to, say, 5. So it's a little more subtle. And then the final touch of this thing, this is getting more and more glossy. I like it. The last touch of this is when you put a shadow underneath it, it gets really convincing. So let's toss a shadow underneath it at this point. And a shadow is going to be, again, just another oval. And this one I'm going to do a little differently. I'm going to draw it as a circle like this. And I want this to be radial. Oh, now I just drew this in the gloss layer. You know what? I'm going to cut it out of there with a Control X. And naturally, I want to have a new layer at the bottom below the eyeball. It's going to be called shadow. And I'm going to paste it back in that layer. And where did I put it? Tell you what, I'll just draw it again. And this particular shadow, I'm double clicking it to go into it. I would like this one to be radial, like that. And the thing about this one is I want the shadow to be darker in the middle and sort of fringe out to transparency on the outside. So, I can just reverse these two. Say, okay, let's start the shadow. And a shadow typically is going to be about 30, maybe 35% opaque at the beginning. It's going to be a shade of, or it's an opacity of black. And this one over here is also going to be black. It's going to go to 5%. You know what? I'm going to change that to 0. So I get something that looks like this. And to make it look even more like a defined shadow, you know what? We can push this crayon over here. So we go from really dark to sort of fading out to transparency over here. And that gives us a really good shadow. Now the location for this, I'm going to go back to the scene. This shadow should be underneath. And the reason I drew it like this as a circle is so it's a nice even sort of fringe around the outside. This is the only way I know to do this. But now I can transform this thing and say, okay, a real shadow should be more like an oval, should be much bigger, and should be placed in just the right place like that. And for this, that shadow would look good, pretty good right about there. Holy moly, so we did it. There is our eyeball. And this was duplicating something like this, but there's lots of little variations you can do on it. It's all the same technique. And notice you can try changing the size of the gloss and the shadow underneath and see what looks best to you. There you go. Hope that helps. Give it a try.